Okay, so I'm going to try to read your mind, okay? Get ready. I sense someone out there in YouTube land, someone who's thinking something like, what in the hell is a psychopomp anyhow? Is that like a psycho that's also pretty pompous? And now I sense someone else starting to come through the veil. Blast your oily hide, Mr. YouTube Smarty Pants. What in the blue blazes is a psychopomp anyhow, dagnabbit? And that may possibly be one of my older viewers, or quite possibly a time-traveling pirate from the 18th century. But in any case, that's Dr. YouTube Smarty Pants to you, you swine. Anyhow, message received. I guess I should start by describing what a psychopomp is. Well, the word psychopomp comes to us from classical Greek, and it literally translates to something like soul guide. Basically, it refers to a character in mythology whose task was to deliver deceased human souls to the realm of the dead. Probably the most familiar example would be the figure of Charon, who was the mythological ferryman whose job it was to transport souls across the river Styx. However, throughout history, psychopomps have appeared in other guises. For instance, the Grim Reaper could be considered a type of psychopomp, as could the Valkyries of Norse legend, or Anubis of ancient Egypt, or even shamans in more recent times. But to me, the most interesting question is, where are our psychopomps today? Have we consigned them to the dustbin of history, or are some of us still acting as deliverers of souls, even if it doesn't seem like it on the surface? Not even to ourselves. And then another related question would be, what might we gain by reclaiming the power of some of those ancient myths and legends? How might their archetypal poetic resonance enhance our lives today? Basically, the question is, what is soul work in a postmodern context, and perhaps more to the point, what can it be? But perhaps the first task in that sort of reclamation would have to do with recovering a sense for what the soul even is in the first place. After all, isn't the soul just another name for a car produced by Kia America Incorporated, if memory serves? And at this point, you may think I'm just being flippant, and maybe I am, especially since I tend to embody a fair amount of the trickster archetype myself. But I'm also trying to make a point, which is that in a postmodern world like ours, a world where everything turns into an ephemeral interplay of surfaces, it can be very difficult to develop an abiding sense for the depth of life. You know, the kinds of experience that make sense of all of the antiquated talk about soul or spirit or the numinous. And that's especially true in a world where pretty much every word that still retains a measure of poetic resonance is almost immediately appropriated as an advertisement gimmick, which then very quickly drains it of its evocative power, especially when it's repeated over and over and over again, thereby reducing it to the level of complete banality. And so maybe before talking about psychopomps or soul work, I should try to evoke a sense for what the soul might even be in the first place. And the best I can do, I think, is to beckon us all toward remembering something we might have experienced at some point in our lives. It might have taken the form of a religious experience, the experience of prayer, for instance, or maybe just the vague sense that our lives play out with respect to something far, far larger than ourselves. And in those sorts of moments, and against that immeasurable backdrop, it's possible to perceive that there's an infinite depth inside of us. So consider the possibility that you're actually a bearer of the infinite, unique and inimitable in the boundless well of who and what you are. And that every breath you take is thoroughly suffused with mystery beyond measure. Consider the possibility that you are on fire, or maybe that you are fire. And yeah, I know it doesn't really seem like it, but maybe you actually are. And so is everyone else. Millions upon millions of us, burning in the night of this world like an endless sea of candles. And one name for the unique flame you call your own would be your soul. Consider the possibility that in the deepest, most recondite reaches of your being, you're an incomprehensible miracle through and through. A magical being in your very essence, beyond category, beyond being named or described or explained. And to borrow a few words from Albert Camus, that no matter how long and cold the winter of your suffering may seem, there lies somewhere within you an invincible summer. And life is asking you to feel it, to witness it, like a brilliant new dawn creeping over the distant horizon, to discover enough daring within yourself to do that, enough courage to awaken to what you really are and what you've been all along. And by the way, notice that at this point, I'm no longer trying to explain anything to you. Instead, I'm trying to remind you of something that has perhaps lain dormant for too many years and through too many hard trials. And if what I'm saying sounds strange, as it well might, well, maybe it's no more strange than your soul is. And maybe the thing that's really weird is not what I'm saying, but how the way of the world has made the language of our souls sound foreign to us. And because of that, we've lost our sense for what words like psychopomp or numinous could possibly mean. The really weird thing is how that sort of vocabulary has been denied to us for too long, and how over time we've forgotten what it feels like to let the soul's poetry fill our ears. What it's like to be transformed and transfigured by it, and eventually to give voice to it ourselves. What it's like to sing to the skies, trembling and our eyes filled with tears, like the ancient poets of a bygone era whose names we can only faintly remember. And while it may seem like a terrible tragedy to discover that we've somehow lost the meaning of our souls, well, who says that it always has to be that way? And so let's explore what being a psychopomp might mean in today's world. Well, first I'd say that it has to do with accompanying souls in passage, like it always did. Maybe not so much in the literal sense of delivering them to whatever might exist after death, but in a more figurative and ultimately more powerful sense. That would include, for instance, the work of psychotherapy, which is basically about accompanying souls in their passage to the distant shore of life's further and hopefully less pathological reaches. And here it's probably worthwhile to note that Carl Jung himself saw psychoanalysis as a kind of soul work, and even invoked the image of the psychopomp to describe it. That's an especially apt description insofar as any sort of deep transformation in our lives begins with a kind of death, and with a doleful requiem for life as we've known it thus far, which in turn means that we must find our way to a very different world that calls for a very different way of being. A world that has changed because we ourselves have changed. And from that point of view, the psychotherapist's work is a lot like Charon's, to navigate together with the client through mournful waters toward the distant shore of eventual metamorphosis. But as an erstwhile academician, I'd also say that in our better moments, the pedagogical situation is a lot like that. And I say in our better moments because in our world, it's usually easier to see teaching mostly in terms of filling our students' minds with bloodless facts, often in a fairly uninspiring and desiccated way, rather than in terms of any type of soul work. Of course, teaching also involves cultivating the capacities of our intellects. But all of that can very easily involve only the outermost surface of our being without reaching very far into its depths. But on the other hand, I'd say that in those comparatively rare, shining moments, those times when teaching does become coterminous with what we really are, it's again about accompanying souls in passage. Basically, about the task of Charon. However, I'd also say that the dynamics at work in those sorts of moments are actually bidirectional. Sure, our students' lives are transformed, but the same is true of our own existence, if we can let it. However, the main point I'm trying to make is that, like psychotherapy, the pedagogical situation is ultimately about a kind of soul work, a way of delivering souls onto their greater destinies, of acting as a kind of psychopomp, much like Charon did. Of course, the trick in the pedagogical situation is not to try to force that dynamic, which is pretty much impossible, but to allow it to unfold when the time is right, while simultaneously satisfying our society's more pragmatic edicts and commandments. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, quite a few years of it actually, that that's not necessarily an easy balance to strike. However, besides psychotherapists and teachers, I'd say that anyone who dares to articulate any kind of difficult truth is basically acting as a kind of psychopomp, especially in a world that's as censorious and controlling as ours is rapidly becoming. And because I'm personally a student of laughter and strategic folly, I'd include comedians among today's psychopomps, along with various sorts of fools, tricksters, poets, artists, and visionaries. Not all of them, to be sure, but at least a few, and enough to make it worth noting. That's because people in those categories are afforded, or at least used to be afforded, a very special, almost shamanic place within our culture. A place where they're allowed to pass beyond the taboos and prohibitions that constrain pretty much everyone else. And the reason they're allowed to do that is that nobody takes them very seriously. We expect them to be eccentric and a little wild and nutty. A little like the oracles and soothsayers of antiquity, perhaps, who would often speak in ways that sounded like complete raving gibberish nonsense, but only because they possessed too much sense for the workaday world and could see into its structure all too deeply. And so they would speak in the strangely prescient language of imminent metamorphosis, in a form of poetry powerful enough to draw us toward the outer edges of who and what we are, and leave us forever changed as a result. And if all of that still seems incomprehensible, well, you can find a great illustration of it in the character of the Seer of Kattegat in the Vikings TV series. If that's your cup of tea, of course. You know, the dude with the black lips and the deformed face, who might himself have been acting as a kind of psychopomp. But I digress. Anyhow, I'd say that comedians and poets and visionaries are vitally important to our world, especially because they sometimes manage to fracture the thin veneer of our overweening self-importance and our petty dictatorial impulses, and allow us to see things from a much wider and wilder perspective. In essence, their art transforms our perceptual fields, or perhaps more accurately, their art invites us to transform our own perceptual fields. Like Charon of ancient mythology, they too beckon us toward undertaking a perilous journey toward distant shores. And along the way, they help what is trivial and petty in us die, so that we can start to see with other eyes and measure with other measures, as Eugen Herrigel once said. And ultimately, become a little wiser and a little better in who and what we are, which in turn makes our world a little better too. But at this point, I'd like to move toward ending this video by making note of the fact that even in everyday life we can begin to act as psychopomps for each other. That's especially true because, if we're honest about it, our souls are always in passage in one way or another, if only in the mode of waiting. And the deeper and more unsettling reality of human existence is that we're always dying, always slipping away, always passing beyond ourselves, minute by minute, and always giving birth to something new, too, to unique and distinct fractal moments in the turning of the cosmos. And as a consequence of that, every breath we take occasions both our departure and our arrival. Basically, to go is to return. Oh my God, it's the darndest thing, isn't it? And all of that's especially true when we're able to hold on to things loosely, when we're able to treat life like the adventure it actually is. So why shouldn't we accompany each other as psychopomps as we make our way across life's raging river via our ongoing metamorphosis through death and rebirth? Is there any real reason other than the deadening weight of social convention, which only fills us with fear, and even a fear of life itself? And becoming Latter-day Psychopomps doesn't even have to take the form of anything dramatic or overly demanding. It could be as simple as saying something we otherwise wouldn't. Something maybe a little more true or a little more lyrical than usual. Or it could be about offering a knowing smile to a friend or a stranger, or even just a brief glance at the right time and in the right place. And at the end of the day, that's the real beauty of the Psychopomps calling. It's not about what we do to or for anyone else. It's about how we are, about how we move from moment to moment in relation to each other. So we don't really have to make it into some kind of elaborate project because, well, because as we gradually become a little more liberated at the level of our own souls, our presence will automatically begin to liberate the people around us. And when we reach that point, I suspect that we'll find out that we're already in passage, already traveling along life's river, along with everyone else in the world. And so then, I guess, the only question will be, well, hell, if that's the case, then why not own it? Anyhow, I guess that's the world according to Eric for today. And yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to listen and watch. I appreciate your presence in this universe, in case no one's told you that recently. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.